Well, good morning, everyone. Good to be back. I had a great vacation week. I only got out fishing one day. That was the first Monday on the 16th, because after that, the remnants of Hurricane Fred came through, and the water turned kind of looks like my coffee with cream in it. You know, it was like high and off the, over the banks. And then just as that was subsiding, then the remnants of Henri came through and did the same thing. But I got to visit friends in State College, visit my brother and family, and visit Father Dan O'Brien, who's recovering from eye surgery. So it was a good, relaxing week. I enjoyed it very much. Last week, we actually concluded with the Bread of Life discourse from St. John, and now we jump back into Mark, and we'll have Mark the rest of the year. And so we come back where we left off, right at chapter 7, and we have once again the Pharisees challenging Jesus and his disciples. And it's over the Mosaic Law, and it's dealing with this idea of cleanliness or uncleanliness. And so that's very foreign to us. We don't understand it. I hope to give a little explanation to it. It's actually quite beautiful in some ways because the intention of it was really good. So this idea of cleanness and uncleanness, on the most part, had nothing to do with sin or being holy, okay? It had to deal with physical contact. Now, you could sin, and I'll get back to that in a moment, but let's just look at the idea first, that the idea of this physical contact that could make you unclean, but you didn't do it because you sinned. It was because of this. It dealt with two basic things, life and death, that God was in control of life and death. We are not. We don't orchestrate our own birth, and we don't orchestrate our own death. That just happens. And so they understood that this is in God's hands. So anything that reached from our control into the realm of God's power, we were literally close to touching the divine. And you could not do that because we're so inferior to God in some ways that we would, especially in our own lack of holiness, would render ourselves unclean but not sinful. And then there were four categories under this general life and death category. So the first was sexual functions, which were the very beginning of life, food, and all regulations about eating food or sustaining life. So all this had to do with sustaining life. You know, we heard cups and jugs and kettles, and they had regulations on what can go on certain plates and foods that were clean and unclean, and you had to wash your hands before you ate. So anything to sustain life, especially like with food and around that, that dealt with life. Then we come to the next stage, which was leprosy or other diseases, which now start to move you to the realm of death. And then finally, death itself and all those things associated with death. And one of the themes running through all four of these categories was blood, because for the Jewish people, blood was absolutely sacred. The blood that courses through our veins is given to us by God, and for the Jewish people, it sustains our life. So there's nothing that can come closer to God, really, in our own bodies than blood itself, which keeps us alive. So that had to be all respected. So with the sexual functions and with childbirth or menstruation, all the other things, you know, it was out of respect and holiness for the gift of life that God has given to us. And that's why we had to respect sexuality and marriage and the sexual actions because they were the beginning of life. And then we had to respect food and the sustaining of life because we have dignity because of life. And then we had to respect even the dying process or in death itself. So even in death, by touching a body, you became unclean. But you had to touch the body because you had to wash the body. You had to shave the body. Their idea was that we come into the world naked with nothing. And when we go back to God, we go back the same way we came with nothing. So the body would be shaved, it would be washed, it would be anointed, wrapped in a linen, this whole beautiful celebration for the death. And then 1 year later, they would go back to the tomb. They would take the bones, now that the only thing that's left, off the shelf, wrap it in the linen that was originally wrapped in. So it would be a little bag, and then they would put in a little ossuary and another set of prayers as 1 year to the day on the anniversary of that death, when they would go back and then put the ossuary into the niche in the wall. So all these ideas had to deal with contact. If you touched anything, you were unclean. You had to go through a ritual of purification, which meant either ritual washing or ritual bathing. So almost all these things had nothing to do with sinfulness or holiness. So for example, if somebody's arm was cut really badly, okay, and they were bleeding badly, I go and put a tourniquet on to save their life, and I get blood on me because I helped save them, I'm rendered unclean. But I didn't sin at all. As a matter of fact, I would have sinned if I did not help them. The Jewish people would say, life is important, you have to help them. But because I touched blood, which is the seed of life, I rendered myself unclean, have to go through this ritual, but I didn't sin. Now, you could sin, but they were in extreme circumstances. So for example, if I go into a pagan temple and worship, I not only made myself unclean by doing something, but then I also sinned because I'm sinning against God. So this is the uncleanness part of it. So the disciples didn't wash their hands before they ate. They're like, oh, you didn't follow the law. And so what Jesus is going after here is that the law was good. It had its purpose. But when the law is lived by the letter and not by the very heart and the meaning of what it's supposed to do, then it's hypocritical. So what Jesus does, if you notice what he does here, because they're asking about unclean, your disciples are unclean, they didn't wash their hands, blah, blah, blah. How does Jesus answer? He turns this whole thing right around, and he goes right after the jugular, because he doesn't use the word unclean. He goes, this is not what defiles a person. Whoa. That's not what the word was that the Pharisees were going after. So Jesus uses a whole different word. He goes, this is what defiles. Because when you became unclean, you couldn't go to the worship until you did this ritual purification. But when you're defiled, you, by sin, you have cut yourself off by serious sin. You've cut yourself off from God, from his life, from the community, from the worship, from your neighbors, until you're reconciled. And so Jesus says that these are the things that defile you, okay? Evil thoughts, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, licentiousness, envy, blasphemy, arrogance, and folly. These, my friends, are mortal sins. These are serious sins. Jesus says these are the things that defile you, not contact of these other areas of touching life or death. That doesn't defile you. Yes, we respect life and death, but what defiles you and cuts you off from God's life are these deadly sins. And so now the last one doesn't sound too bad, folly, but it's deadly because wisdom is following the love of God. Folly is following the hatred of the devil. And so folly is a very serious sin, even though to us it sounds just like foolishness, but not for the Jewish people. And so St. John in his first letter will also talk about what Jesus says here. He'll talk about sin, and he'll talk about deadly. He calls it deadly, which we call mortal, and he calls non-deadly, which we call venial, okay? Venial or non-deadly does not cut us off from our relationship with God, okay? There are imperfections that we do or small sins that we commit through our human weakness, but they're not in the severe category that cut us off from the life of God. But deadly sins do. So what St. John will say is that for non-deadly sins, venial sins, he goes, those can be remitted by prayer. And so they are. Today, they're still remitted by prayer. One of the greatest prayers is the Eucharist, the Holy Communion. So receiving Holy Communion wipes away our venial sins. Acts of charity, acts of kindness, all those things wipe away venial sins. But we cannot wipe away mortal sins by ourselves, by doing those kinds of actions, because we have actually cut ourselves off from God. Only God can restore it by us being reconciled back to him by his grace. And so that's why Jesus says that these sins are the sins that defile and cut you off from God. So Jesus came so that we don't have to be defiled anymore when we do sin that way. And what does he say? These things come from within us, not from contact of outside external things, but from within our hearts and souls, from our will, from our passions. And so when we think about it, everything that's inside of us that God has given to us is a gift, all right? So we have emotions, we have passions, we have drives that are all natural that God has given us. But through sin of Adam and Eve, they are all thrown out of kilter. So by God's grace, we need to be able to control those things. So I'll give you an example. All the emotions we have, all the passions we have, the drives we have are super, super good. And naturally they are there because God put them there. So let's take anger, all right? Where does anger come from? Well, anger, actually, a lot of times when I was a kid, I just thought anger was bad. It was, oh, it's a sin. No, it's not. What we do with it can be a sin. Anger comes from the virtue of justice. When something is done wrong to me, or we wrong somebody else, or we see something else wronged or somebody else wronged, we get angry. Why? Because a hurt has been done, damage has been done. Anger arises because justice demands that the wrong be remedied. So let's say somebody says, Father Bob is such a terrible, lousy fisherman. I caught just a couple little fish this week, okay? So I get angry, all right? And so I get my .357 and I go and shoot their tires out in their car and I shoot their windows out in their house, endangering family. I'm like, is that a response? Is that the kind of response anger is supposed to have? No. Very, very wrong, okay? That's a very, very wrong way. We have to take our drives, our passions, and those emotions, and we have to harness them in a good way, okay? So we see a wrong in the world, and we go and we remedy it, all right? That's what's supposed to happen. Anger is supposed to actually lead to something good, to remedy the wrong that has happened and turn the hearts of people back to God. So you can go through all the different emotions and drives that we have and realize that, we can use it for wrong if we just let our passions be unbridled. If we did, every one of us would be in jail right now. If we harness them with the power of God's grace, we can use them for good, and that's what God wants. So Jesus is going after this hypocrisy of following the externals of this law, while at the same time disregarding the very center of our heart, soul, and will. And he says, this is where we defile. So we defile ourselves. We cannot once again get back into union with God until God brings us back in union, which means we have to have contrition, sorrow, accept his mercy, and we're given back our life. And this is what Jesus has died for, so that we don't have to be slaves or imprisoned by our passions and by being defiled, that we can come to God, be freed, and live once again for him. And so Jesus rendered, at the end of this gospel, it says he rendered all foods clean, but what's more important, Jesus can render our hearts clean. And that is the greatest gift we have in our faith, that no matter how we fail, Jesus always can render our hearts and souls and wills clean and wants us to access that mercy of his. And so our job is to take careful role of our life and especially our intentions within us. When I examine my conscience before confession, and I go once a month to my confessor, I usually use the Ten Commandments, which are excellent, and I use these deadly sins that Jesus speaks about, because they really cover all the avenues of our life and really all the avenues of our emotions, our passions, and our drives that can be misused. So Jesus wants us, by the power of his love and grace, to not allow ourselves to go into inordinate desires just unbridled, but to absolutely have control of those things, that we can use them for good. First of all, for ourselves, to grow in our friendship, our love for God. And if that happens, then that's going to flow into love of neighbor, love of family. So today, as we reflect on this gospel, we ask the Lord to help us, that we can always choose good over evil in our own hearts, by the power of our own will, with the great help of God's grace. And if we do keep watch over our hearts, then the promise that Jesus made at the Sermon on the Mount will be the promise fulfilled for us. Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. Praise be Jesus Christ, now and forever. Amen.